Good evening and welcome to BBC Radio Leicester.
Good evening and welcome to the start of a very special weekend here at Radio Leicester. It is, of course, its 20th birthday, and Brian and I have come along to join in the celebrations and to meet up with some old friends.
Yes, Maggie and I are in fact old boys of Radio Leicester, and during its 20-year history, BBC Local Radio has produced many well-known names in British broadcasting, people like Steve Wright, Mike Reed, Adrian Just, Kate Adie, Nicholas Witchell, Michael Burke, and a host of others.
But tonight we're going to look at the work of what you might call the unsung local heroes, the people who work night and day to bring you the local news, the local weather, the local traffic news, and of course keeping you bang up to date with all the local events.
People with specialist local knowledge who collect information which has become the backbone of the BBC's news gathering operation throughout Britain.
And of course it's obvious that it's in times of crisis like the recent hurricanes and floods that local radio really does come into its own. But first, let's go back 20 years.
And what a day. We've had the Postmaster General to open the station, the Lord Mayor of Leicester's had a say, and we've got more visitors in the studio this afternoon.
And in fact, the very first voice to be heard on Radio Leicester in 1967, and indeed on our programme tonight, belongs to Michael Murray, who's been able to join us in one of the studios. Now, what did it feel like on that first day? I mean, was there a sensation of making history?
Sensation of fright, I think, was the main thing. We were very, very crowded in the studio. We had lots of people from the press, from the BBC hierarchy, from members of the City Council. Everybody seemed to be crowded into these two little rooms. And, of course, everybody wanted to have a say in it, too. So it was very, very difficult to sit down and make a welcoming announcement without feeling sort of overcrowded. It was very frightening, really, I think, for all of us.
The story that I like is that you say that that room next door was filled with the world's press,
Yeah,
but there was one newspaper missing.
There was indeed, the Leicester Mercury, who had ignored our existence. There were press from Hong Kong and Australia and all over Britain, but not the Leicester Mercury. They didn't want to know.
And the intriguing thing is that they sort of had some control over what you called the station, didn't they?
We had to call it BBC Radio Leicester because it turned out fairly soon, fairly early, just before the broadcast went on, that someone had bought the title Radio Leicester, so we couldn't use it legally, and we had to put BBC in front of it.
Now, in those days, you really were paving the way. There were no other local radio stations to emulate. You had to make your own mistakes, didn't you?
You're right. Nobody knew exactly what we were going to meet. In fact, it was in those first days we didn't even know what to call programmes. I remember somebody suggesting we should have Traffic Island discs, and another programme suggested was Your Member for the Member of Parliament. Luckily, these were dropped and more suitable titles were chosen. But it was very difficult to really get a picture of what we were supposed to be doing until we'd been at it for about a year.
Well, thanks very much, Michael. You've painted a very lively picture of what those early days were like.
Now, this is what I call a wireless. It's even older than me, a lot older actually. But back in 1967, radios were a lot more cumbersome than today's pocket-sized or even credit-sized radios. Now, technology has developed quite considerably over the last 20 years, and one person who's had to cope with and adapt to those changes is Radio Leicester's chief engineer, Martin Lane. Now, Martin, when the station went on in the air, you'd already had problems, hadn't you?
That's right. Our new transmitter site was only across a field from Leicester's main heart hospital at Ruby Road. And when they were testing the aerial, they caused a lot of interference to the heart electronics equipment in the hospital. But it turned out for the good in the end. It's the first time this had happened, and after that they redesigned a lot of the equipment in the hospital to not be cause problems by interference.
First time, in fact, that local radio has been mentioned in Lancet, I think.
That's
but
right.
Of course, you also had problems being only on VHF when broadcasting first started.
Yes, there were very few VHF radios around then, and no car radios as far as I know, and listeners did have a problem. They had to change radios in order to get us.
Well, eventually the station went on to medium wave, but even then some of the equipment was rather old, wasn't it?
Yes, the first transmitter we had was an old wartime one, which had an aerial tied up in a chimney and was on an old hospital site, and that was very unreliable.
I seem to remember in some strong winds that transmitter actually fell down.
Yes, I was called out one morning and they said it didn't work very well, and when I got there the aerial had fallen down and was lying on the wet pavement, except the power was still on, so where the aerial was on the pavement it had dried it.
Another lucky escape from local radio. And of course the staple diet for so many radio stations is the radio car. Now, what sort of form did that take in the early days?
Again, it was a lot more primitive. We had to take a seat out in order to get all the equipment in. It had 3 huge lorry batteries in the back with no means of charging them. We had to actually bring them up to the 8th floor of this building to charge the batteries. And it was less reliable generally.
Now, when problems arise in terms of the weather, as we've recently experienced, of course, local radio has come very much into its own. What are the notable events that you remember as far as bad weather conditions in Leicestershire are concerned?
The year we started, there was quite bad flooding in Leicester, and we had to take the radio car up to the Saffron Lane area particularly, where we were wandering around in wellies and the car up to its exhaust pipe in water. Then after that, the electricity strikes were the real problem, and we weren't geared up then to operate without electricity. We had no standby diesel generators as we have now.
So you had to rely on batteries, I think.
It was all improvised, yes, batteries. We had to hire little generators to keep the transmitter on the air. One of our stations even hired an ice cream van to use the generator in it to keep the transmitter working.
Well, I have to admit that on one occasion I damaged the radio car. I knocked the aerial off, the transmitting aerial. I'd like to offer you now a £5 towards the cost of the damage.
In our present parlour state, we will accept every £5 with gratitude.
Marty Lane, thanks very much.
Well, I've got in front of me a really rather interesting document here, because if you take a look at this, you'll see that this is my original local radio contract. It's for the princely sum of £4.20, and when I started that covered me for 2 days a week. Now, I've been joined now by a former station manager, that's Owen Bentley, who now of course is head of local radio for the Midlands. Now, I can't really take you to task about this because you weren't station manager when I was here, but I will tell you that when my work was expanded to 3 days, I still got paid £4.20.
Had I known you were there, I would have recognised your talent immediately and given you the full rate, which would have been an extra 20 pence.
Now, I know that local radio had some particularly good news in September because the governors announced they were going to go ahead with the plans to open some new radio stations and complete the network.
Very good news indeed. It means that local radio will now be available to everybody in England. We're opening another 7 stations, and then we are going to, in the Midlands here, we're going to build 3 stations.
So
here's 3 stations. Well, the first one is going to be next autumn, and that will be Radio Gloucester, BBC Radio Gloucestershire. That will be in the autumn of 1988. That will be followed by Radio Hereford and Worcester in December-ish, 88, and then in 89, March 89, we'll be putting Radio Warwickshire on the air.
I have to say, I'm very relieved it's me not me who's sticking those things on, because they always fall off. Now, it really did seem that the BBC was giving you with one hand and yet taking away with the other, because a fortnight ago, Michael Checkland said 10% cuts to local radio.
Well, I obviously prefer the good news and I don't like the bad news as much, because local radio is a very lean animal. We're a very, very cost-effective part of the BBC. The problem is, the BBC needs to save some money. The licence fee is pegged to the retail price index. Our inflation is running higher than ordinary inflation. So every single department in the BBC over the next few years has got to take some cuts. Local radio has got to take a few more cuts than others. But on the other hand, we've got 3 new stations. Is it ironic? I think it's bittersweet, really.
Surely it's going to affect the quality of the programmes.
Well, we're not having to make cuts immediately. That's the very good news. But there is a danger that we might turn into a local radio that has got more music in, the more speech, and we're very, very proud of our speech-based output. Public service local radio, serving the community, local voices and so on. Real problem. But our listeners are the licence fee payers, aren't they? The licence fee payers, in the Director General's terms, are the shareholders of the BBC. Shareholders like us. They've been voting for us with their feet, with their ears. They've been listening to us all the time. I'll leave our future secure in the hands of our shareholders.
Okay, thank you very much, Owen. Strong words there. Right, how's the birthday cake going?
Very well indeed, Maggie. In fact, I suppose everybody here hopes we're all going to be back again in 20 years' time. As Maggie said, how's the birthday cake going? You know, no birthday party would be complete without a birthday cake. And as part of its celebrations this week, Radio Leicester has been making a cake-making competition. And These are the entries. I think it just goes to show just what good taste Radio Leicester listeners have got. Some remarkable entries here, and I think it indicates the sort of support, a very dedicated support, that BBC local radio, not just here at Leicester, but around the Midlands, everywhere around the local radio network, has a very fine support, and that's where local radio has really succeeded over the years. Well, I don't think there's anything else for us to do but to crack open the mandatory bottle of champagne. We've had the birthday party, we've got the cake, we've got Maggie here, and let's bring in to Jeremy Robinson, the present station manager here at BBC Radio Leicester.
This is the most difficult thing to do live.
Absolutely. There we are. I think we've shot a BBC cameraman over there somewhere. That's it. Wonderful stuff. Jeremy's not very used to doing this. You don't do this in local radio very often. And we've got something special for Maggie. You know, it's her condition, you know. So we'd like to say all the very best and happy birthday, BBC Radio Leicester, and 20 years of BBC local radio. Cheers.
Martin Ballard looks at the broadcasting experiment that worked.
On November the 8th, 1967, the dinner jacket image of Auntie was left in London when BBC Radio Leicester began broadcasting for just 6 hours a day from studios at Epic House.
Well, it was a November day, and it was a rather dismal day outside, but very cheerful inside. We had the Postmaster General there. He came specially, and I thought that was a very promising sign.
And what a day. We've had the Postmaster General to open the station, the Lord Mayor of Leicester's had a say, and we've got more visitors in the studio this afternoon.
Very small staff. I think it numbered 17 altogether, gathered round us, and I looked at them and, you know, with great admiration, but wondering whether so small a group of people could handle such a considerable responsibility. If Leicester had failed, the whole experiment might have collapsed.
They were very exciting times. Many of us had been filched from the local newsroom of the local evening newspaper, so we knew nothing about broadcasting, and we had to deal with monsters like these behind us. At least they appeared monsters in those days. We had to go to London for 2 weeks training, and we came back, and it was remarkable. Everything we did was new.
Oh, that's very interesting.
The thing that sticks in my mind is the welcome that we got from people, not only from people, but actually into their homes. And many programmes we did almost instantaneously live from people's living rooms.
Well, in the first place, when I first heard about Radio Leicester, I was so interested in it, and I thought, I'm not going to have autographs on pieces of paper to be thrown away. So I'd got this cloth already started on by family and friends, and I met Dave Challis first and Wendy Blair. That started my interest in Radio Leicester, and I really loved it, and I've kept on like that for 30 years.
It is, of course, now one of a network of 40 local services up and down the country. Giles Taylor has this report.
This is Roger Matthews. Welcome to Radio Leicester.
November the 8th, 1967, and Radio Leicester became the very first in a new wave of BBC local radio stations. It began as a 2-year experiment. Ken Warburton was one of the original presenters.
There was no book written about how do you do it. You just made it up and did it. And some of what we did was, I've got to say, pretty appalling. But it was locally appalling, and some of what we did was really very good.
The experiment was a success, and 50 years on, there are now 40 stations all over the country. The milestone was celebrated today with a special performance by Leicester Cathedral's bell ringers. BBC Radio Leicester moved to its current home in 2005, and today a special party was held in the foyer for around 70 staff and editors from both past and present.
I think local radio is still really important. It is the 6th biggest radio network in England. It is important for connecting communities. It's also really important for holding people to account. And I think it's just as relevant today as it was 50 years ago.
People might be listening in different ways, but actually knowing what's going on, hearing about your place on the radio, in the news, and having someone to go to when you're not sure where else to go to, that's not going to go away.
Meanwhile, around 1,000 fans are expected to enjoy a special birthday celebration tonight at De Montfort Hall. Giles Taylor, BBC East Midlands Today, Leicester.